Hey there, and thank you everybody for joining, and thank you for that intro, Joe. As Joe said, my name is Adam Keller, and I'm a developer advocate on the container services team here at AWS. And if you're not familiar with me, I tend to host a lot of workshops throughout the year. I talk all about container services on AWS, and very specifically services like Amazon ECS, AWS App Runner, uh, Amazon ECR, really all of these rich services that we have, and EKS as well, to help support our customers have successful lead a successful path with containers on AWS. So just a little bit about me, but before I dive into the workshop, I've been working with containers since the early days, since Docker was announced. And when it was when folks would talk about Docker and they would say, "Oh, no, you don't run containers in production. This is just for testing." And even when Docker was, and containers were production ready, and by the way, containers have been around a long time. I think Docker just simplified the packaging and the management and deployment of containers and running containers in real world environments. But even when it was production ready, folks were still timid, and it was still a scary new technology. But since then, it's just grown so much, and so many customers, so many people out there are running containers in production today and have seen tremendous success with containers. So, I started with Docker very early on. Started small, used containers to automate our testing of our environments, and from there, I was able to go from simply testing and using containers for testing to migrating production applications, taking monolithic applications and breaking them down into more service-oriented architectures with more microservice-based applications using containers. And so I've led many migrations, built brand new greenfield applications, designed all to AWS. So, I was able to do this by leveraging technologies like Docker, as well as managed services like Amazon ECS, and so on. So one of my favorite stories in my career was I started at a company. It was a startup, security startup, was doing really great things. And but one of the biggest challenges when I started at the company was it took 3 weeks to get features deployed, to get bug fixes deployed. There were 3-week deployment cycles. And by leveraging containers, and we were able to migrate to an orchestrator. We migrated to Mesos at the time, and then eventually to Amazon ECS. But we were able to go from 3-week deployment cycles to multiple deployments a day. So that was obviously it's a little more than just using the technology, the containers. There's culture and processes that have to change as well. But the technology definitely helps jumpstart that and gives you the tools you need to be successful, to move faster and safer as well. So definitely speed is good, but safety is just as important when deploying. So here's what we're going to do today. First and foremost, we're going to talk about AWS App Runner. So we're going to talk a little bit about AWS App Runner, and then we're going to go straight into deploying a web service with AWS App Runner. One thing about App Runner that's just so, I think the future of containers is where we're going with App Runner, where you as the user just want to run your applications. Very similar to the model that you see with AWS Lambda, where I have code, I want to run that code, but I don't want to worry about all of the underlying infrastructure, all the components to get that code up and running. And I think this is where App Runner really shines. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So to follow along with me, there's going to be kind of two paths here. One, if you want to follow along with me as I'm building and deploying in the workshop, you're going to want to go to apprunnerworkshop.com. Now, this workshop's publicly available, and after I'm done today, it's still going to be available. So this is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no cost, apprunnerworkshop.com. if you want to run through, the workshop at your own pace. So just depending on how you want to do it. The other option is you can just sit back and watch me as I deploy, as I talk through the service, and then ask any questions. So we have a chat here. We have some amazingly smart people in the chat here to answer your questions as well. So if somehow, there's something that's just top of mind you want to ask, fire away in chat. And if it's something that, maybe I can bring up here as well, I will do that. So please bring the questions. We want to answer them. We want to help you be successful today and, after today, of course, with our technologies. So let's start by just talking about what AWS App Runner is. So if you've ever run containers, or if you haven't run containers, it doesn't really matter. But generally, the way folks run containers in an environment today is you need what's called an orchestrator. And when we think of an orchestrator, this is a control plane that essentially its job is to make sure that your containers are running with the max replica counts, that the desired state of your deployments is being met. That's the job of an orchestrator. So common orchestrators are like Kubernetes, EKS, Amazon EKS, which is managed Kubernetes, and then Amazon ECS, where we manage the control plane as well, but a step further, where you have no management of the control plane, meaning you don't have to think about upgrading it, patching it, or scaling it. So the control plane, if you think of it like an orchestra, where you have the conductor, who the conductor's job is to make sure that all the instruments are following proper timing, and they're coming in and going out as needed. So that's really the job of the orchestrator. And generally, this is something that will be referenced as maybe the cluster. So when you launch a cluster, this is going to be that control plane in the cluster. Now, on top of that, I need to think about how am I going to now have the orchestrator schedule the containers to run. And this is where the compute comes into play. So I have my control plane, which is telling my containers, or which is basically saying, here's the definition, here's what you want to run. Now I need to run it somewhere. So years ago, prior to AWS Fargate being released, you would have to have your own EC2 instances or your own virtual machines join the cluster. And as they're in the cluster, you need to think about patching, scaling, monitoring the health of your underlying virtual machines. But ultimately, this is where the orchestrator will schedule your containers to run. So that's kind of the anatomy of, very basic of running containers in an environment today. Now, there's so much more that goes into it, right? And I'm not going to dive into all the underlying details, but at a high level, that's what the orchestrator's for, and that's why we have them. But with that comes management. And regardless of where you're running your containers, you still have to think about if you're going to, auto scaling. If you want to scale your containers out to meet the demand of your traffic. So whether that's based on like a metric like CPU or something like, total requests that your containers are receiving per second. You have to think about that. You have to build that scaling. You have to be aware of how that all works. So there's still management that has to be done, regardless of the orchestrator that you use. So generally, this is where you need a team, or you have to be aware of how the orchestrator works and how to stitch all of these components together. So with all that said, this is where App Runner comes in. So think of App Runner as a service that provides a highly abstracted, simple, managed experience for running web applications and API services. So with App Runner, you simply say, here's my source code, or here's my container image, and run it. And at the end, App Runner is going to give you an endpoint that you're going to be able to access that code running in a real environment. So all of that underlying stuff that I just mentioned, the orchestrator, launching on the compute, All of that, you don't have to think about with App Runner. It's all fully managed for you. Auto scaling, that's built into App Runner. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Also, the other thing I didn't mention is when you have to build CI/CD pipelines. So no matter what, when you're getting to a production environment, it is good practice, recommended practice, that you are wrapping your builds and your deployments into a pipeline. We do not want humans being the ones that are manually going into a console, configuring things for deployments. This should be automated and repeatable. So App Runner will connect to either your repository in Amazon ECR or your registry, your container registry in ECR, or your repository in GitHub, and it can automatically trigger deployments once you push a new change to your repository or to your container image. So all of these things that generally take teams, DevOps teams, even development teams that want to build this on their own, all of these things that take time to build, App Runner is managing, building, and abstracting away from you as the user. So you're really just focused on, here's my code, let's get it deployed, let's get it up and running. So as we go through the workshop today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a checkpoint at, kind of checkpoints along the way. And I'm going to talk about what did App Runner do here and what would it have taken for me to do that on my own without App Runner's help. So we'll walk through that. Again, if there are any questions here, please bring them in the chat. So you may see me, look to the side here every so often just to check out if there's any questions. And again, we have really great folks here that are going to help answer those as well. Okay. So let's get started. So again, it is available at apprunnerworkshop.com. So very simple, straightforward, apprunnerworkshop.com. And to get started, we're going to click the Start the Workshop, and we will go to Create a Workspace. Now, I've already done this, but I'm still going to walk through it just in case folks want to do this and follow along with me. But what we're going to do is launch a Cloud9 instance in basically the region that you prefer. Cloud9 is a cloud-based interactive development environment, an IDE. This is an AWS service, so it's a fully managed IDE. It launches behind the scenes. It launches an EC2 instance, which is where your IDE runs. Now, what we do is we'll go to Cloud9 in the console. So there's a link here that you can follow. And it looks like the link is bad. I meant to fix that. My apologies. So just if you go to the console, you just type Cloud9, you'll see it here. Click Cloud9. Now here you're going to click Create an Environment. And then we'll name the environment App Runner Workshop. Hit Next Step. I already have one because I already have that name. So actually, let's do this. Let's just do App Runner Workshop. Next step. We're going to keep all the defaults here, with the exception is we're going to use a T3 small as our instance type. So another really neat thing about Cloud9 is it has a cost saving setting feature built in where you will basically, it will shut down the instance after a certain amount of time that you've deemed appropriate here. So you can see the default is after 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes of inactivity, it'll shut down. And then we're just going to hit Next Step, and then we're going to hit Create Environment. And then when the environment comes up, this is what we'll see. Now, I do see there was a question about a participant hash. So this workshop is primarily, so it's just me running through this. If, one thing we don't have for this workshop today, we don't have like credit codes or anything right now, but if there, you want to get some credit codes to run through this on your own, you can always reach out to me on Twitter, and I can find a way to shoot you a credit code, for like $20 or something, just to test this in your account, your environment. So it's spinning up right now. It's going to take a few minutes, not a few minutes, really like 2 minutes max. So we'll close everything out. Okay, so we're going to close this all out. And then we'll close. And I'm going to just go back to the workshop steps here. So basically, you just open a new terminal. And the workspace should eventually look like this. Okay, so we'll just click this plus button, new terminal. And I have a really long username. Okay, and what we'll do is, you actually probably don't need to do this for this workshop. But maybe it's probably good. So if we just run this command here, what this is going to do, it's going to increase the disk space on the Cloud9 instance. I believe the default is 8 gigs, and we increased it to 30. The bottom line is, it's just 8 gigs is small with the operating system and everything else installed there. So just run through that command. It's going to reboot. I know you don't have to reboot the instance after you increase the disk space, but for simplicity, we just do, because you absolutely can resize the disk on the fly as well. Okay, so once that's done, the terminal is going to come back up, and we're going to have a fresh running terminal, and we're ready to go. So the next thing we want to do is we're going to go to create an IAM role for your workspace. And this is where, because we're going to be working on the workspace as we progress later in the workshop, we're going to push to ECR. We're going to do some things from the command line. It's a good idea to just attach this role. So, by the way, when you test this environment, when you're running through this workshop, please do this in a test account. Do this somewhere where you're not running production workloads. Always just be safe. That way you just don't accidentally do something in a production account. It's just always recommended. Test account, something just where you can, sandbox, play around. So just follow this link. It's going to take you to the IAM console. It's going to pre-populate the role, the name of the IAM role, the IAM policy to attach that role. You'll just keep clicking next until you get to create role. Make sure it says App Runner Workshop Admin. You'll click create role. Then you'll go back to the EC2 instance, and you'll click this here and go to manage EC2 instance. And by the way, my Twitter handle is @RealAdamJKeller. If you want to reach out. Okay. So this is, then you'll click on your instance. You'll go to security, modify IAM role, and then attach your policy. Okay. And then hit save. Okay. So at this point, we are ready to start the workshop. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by deploying a simple web service. Okay. But even before we do that, we want to, we're going to need to set up a repository in GitHub. So if you don't have a GitHub account, I would say now's a good time to do that. Or you may just want to watch me at this point and just watch as I go through, set up GitHub, and show how that all works. Okay, so for our first example of what we're going to deploy, we're going to take a very simple Node.js app. It's going to be an Express.js application. It's going to be a simple web server. And again, this is just to show, here's what we can do, with App Runner, and here's what it takes to get deployed. Obviously, every use case is different. This actually brings me to the point, when we think about App Runner, a very common question is, how do I determine, do I run this in App Runner or do I run this somewhere else? Maybe like Amazon ECS with, AWS Fargate, or where do I run this? So the first thing is App Runner at this time, but, I'll explain in a moment why I say at this time. So at this time, App Runner is going to build a publicly exposed web service. So if you're building a REST API, you're building a Flask application or a node application, something that's front, public facing, App Runner is going to be a great solution for you. So right now, App Runner, it doesn't run in your VPC. It is a public resource that's available. So those are really the use cases. It's a public facing API or web service that you want to build. App Runner is perfect for that. And so with that said, a couple things you can do with App Runner, which we'll show in a little bit, but App Runner can connect to other AWS resources. So if you're familiar with AWS, the way you're able to access services within AWS, so for example, Amazon S3, our distributed object storage service. If you have an S3 bucket, in order to communicate with that S3 bucket, the way you would do this is you would attach an IAM policy to a role, and you would attach that role to that resource running. And that's how that resource can determine whether or not it can talk to that S3 bucket. That's where you define your permissions in an IAM policy. So with App Runner, you can attach an IAM role and give it the access to AWS services. So what we don't support in App Runner right now is if you have a service running in a VPC. So if you have a service running in a VPC, maybe it's like a database, like an RDS instance. So RDS is a relational database service, and you're running a Postgres database there. If it's public facing, of course, you could access that. But generally, databases are not publicly exposed, right? So the way you would access that would be through, security groups, through the network traffic there. It wouldn't be IAM. You can attach IAM roles and use IAM to access resources in RDS, but generally this is a service you're talking over, a certain port, and it's a call over the network that requires generally like VPC access. So this is a feature we're working on. So keep an eye out there. If you have an App Runner service that's front facing that you need to have talk to a service running in your VPC, we are working on that. So keep an eye on the App Runner roadmap, which I'll share in a little bit. But there is a roadmap out there that you can keep track of all the features that we're working on, and that we'll be releasing. Okay, so and the last thing with App Runner is if you need your service to run in a private network, App Runner at this time doesn't solve that problem because it gives you that public-facing endpoint, that public-facing URL. It does not support private running services. Now, with all that said, keep an eye on our roadmap. We are working on these things, and we're working on making App Runner super awesome and super flexible. So it is a very opinionated service that does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And just as we grow, as we get more customer feedback, you'll see we'll continue to make it more accessible for different customer use cases that are out there. So keep an eye on these things. And shameless plug, you can always follow me on Twitter at @RealAdamJKeller, because as we release things, we will do live shows when we release new features, especially bigger features with services like App Runner. We have a show called Containers from the Couch where we'll talk about these things. So just keep an eye out there is all I'm saying, okay? Because we're going to be releasing cool stuff in the future here. Quick coffee break. Okay. So our Node.js application consists of two files. One is our index.js. This is going to be our web server. So this is our code for how we're going to serve our web service. And then we have a package JSON. This package JSON just describes our dependencies that we need to install in order for our code to run. So let's proceed to the next step. And what we're going to do is we are going to create this repository in GitHub. So we'll start by going to github.com/new. And you're going to check private. You're going to name the repository Simple Express App. So simply, it'll be your GitHub username here, and then the repository name, simple-express-app. Check private, click create repository. So when you're working in GitHub, it's most common, I would say. I don't even know if it's most common. For me, a common practice is to work from the command line. But that said, for the purpose of the workshop, we're actually going to create files in the GitHub UI. So what we'll do is once the repo is created, click creating a new file right here. And that's going to open up basically this editor here. Okay. And you're going to copy this code right here. Okay. And then you're going to paste it into here. So, I have this repo here. If I were to, actually, let's just do it. So if I were to, when it opens up, it would look something like this. So this is what your code should look like. And let me zoom in because I want to make sure everybody can see. And that's another thing. If folks have any issues with the fonts, please let me know. So you can see here, a very simple Express application, Hello World. I know it's a Hello World app. Don't at me. But what we're doing here is we're basically creating our app. We're listening on port 3000. And when you go to the root of the application, you're just going to get a Hello World response. Now, we are also logging this in the console. So that means that our application logs should log that response as well. So what we'll do is we're going to just click commit changes, and that's going to create that file. And you're going to follow this process for the package JSON as well. So for the package JSON, you're going to go to the repository. You're going to click add file, create new file. You're going to name it package.json, and then go back to the workshop here. And we're just going to copy this. We have nice little copy buttons here, but you can see our package JSON just says we need Express. This is our module we need. And we'll just paste it and then hit commit new file. And at this point, what we'll have, let me leave there. What we will have is our index.js and our package JSON, and now we are ready to run an application. If I were to run this locally, which I actually could, let's do that really quick, just really fast. See, and this is where I tend to go outside the box here. So if I were to actually, we'll do that later. We'll do it later because we're going to build a Docker image. Okay. So that's it. We have our files. We have our Git repository ready to go. What we're going to do next is we're going to actually create a service in App Runner. So there's two ways you can deploy your code to App Runner. One is you can just say, here's my source code. Here's how you install my dependencies, and here's how you run my application. Or two, you can simply point your service to a Docker image stored in Amazon ECR or Elastic Container Registry. So those are the two ways. Now, for the first method, the two languages that are supported right now are Python and Node.js. So those are the two apps that are supported using the simply provide your code method. For the Docker image, that's up to you. App Runner will just run a Docker. We'll run that container from that Docker image. So if there's a language you're working with, you're familiar with Docker, you want to build your own images, you can use the Docker image approach on your own. But definitely, for folks that are new to containers or that are just getting started, they may not want to have to think about building a Docker image or, all the, everything that goes into that. And that's okay. I think Docker files, the way you describe your application and your deployment with Docker files, I think is written in a relatively easy to understand way with very simple instructions. But it's okay if you don't want to do that. App Runner will support you and your use case of just, here's my code, here's how you run my code. Now leave me alone and just deploy it. So that's what we're going to start with first. Okay, so now we're going to go to the App Runner console. And everything we're doing right now is in the console today. There are other ways you can deploy your App Runner services through CloudFormation, the AWS SDK, the AWS Copilot CLI, which is a fantastic guided experience command line utility that will help get your applications deployed in a guided way, which maybe I'll talk about that a little later as well if we have some time. So we're going to go to the console. Okay, now at this point, you can run through all this here in the workshop. But what I'm going to do is just go through the console and run through the deployment. The one thing to point out is it will prompt you to create a new GitHub connection. All this does is this creates a connection from AWS App Runner to GitHub to allow App Runner to pull that code from your repository, as well as create webhooks to, if you enable automated deployments, to have automatic deployments when you push to that repository. So let's get started. Okay, so we're going to go to the App Runner console, and we're going to click Create Service. So you can see here, it's a very simple kind of walkthrough in the console here. There's not a lot that you have to choose from. So we choose, do we want to deploy, or where's our source? Is it going to be from a container image stored in a registry, or is it from a source code repository? So we're starting with the source code repository because we created that code in GitHub. So we're going to, so I have a connection already. And so what we're going to do is Express Apps. We're going to find our application here. And if you don't have a connection, this is where you'll click Add New. A pop-up will come up. Just set up that connection with GitHub. Point it to this repository only. That way you don't, just for your own sanity, it's just for this demo, for this example, you're just pointing to your one repository that we just created for demo purposes. Okay. And you can see at the bottom here, we have two options for deployments. One is the manual deployment trigger. So if I don't want automated deployments, I choose that one. But if I want App Runner to trigger deployment for every time I push a change to the main branch on my repository, then I'm going to check automatic. So if you take a moment to think about this, what does it take to do this on your own? So first of all, you have to have a pipeline somewhere, which means you need a CI/CD service or tool. And whether that's something you run on your own, you use SaaS, use an AWS service like AWS Code Pipeline, or an open source tool like Jenkins, you have to figure out how you're going to build and define this pipeline. For App Runner, you don't have to think about that. You don't have to do anything if you choose automatic deployments for source code. All you're saying is, App Runner, take care of this. I'm just going to write my code. I'm going to submit a pull request, get peer review, and once that code's merged, App Runner is going to deploy that code for you. The next thing that's really cool to talk about is, how does App Runner actually handle your deployments? So behind the scenes, App Runner does a blue-green deployment. So we have your version, your blue version, which is running, of your active code. You push your source code with the change. App Runner is going to bring up a copy. It's going to health check the copy of the service, make sure it's all healthy, and then it's going to flip the switch to your latest code. So you're getting blue-green deployments built in by default out of the box. So that's pretty amazing. You don't have to build any custom blue-green deployment automation. It's just there, ready to go. So what we're going to do now is we're going to configure our settings. So with App Runner, you can use a configuration file to define. It's a YAML file that just says what we're about to do, but it's just defining that in YAML. But for the demo here, we're going to configure in the console. So we're going to choose our runtime. And as I said, the languages supported right now are Node.js and Python. So we'll choose Node.js. And so if we just go down here, we're going to do, we're going to say npm install. Here's how we run our service. And then here's the port we want to run it on. So we'll go back here, npm install. And then we're going to say node index.js. And the port we want to run on is 3000. So that's it. Okay, this is all the work I've had to do to get my environment ready to go. So I'm going to name the service, and what we'll name it is simple. I'm going to name it App Runner Demo Node.js. You can choose your compute and memory. If you want to add environment variables, you can do that as well. And environment variables, especially when you're automating the build and deploy of all this. So if you are using CloudFormation to have to build and manage your App Runner services, you may have different environments. So obviously in App Runner, if you're talking to, let's say, a Dynamo database, DynamoDB, NoSQL database, the production database is going to have a different endpoint than the development table. So environment variables help you to differentiate between those two things. And again, with IAM roles, so remember I mentioned you can actually attach an IAM role to your App Runner services. So to talk to that DynamoDB table, to talk to that S3 bucket, to an SQSQ, SNS topic, etc., you would create the IAM policy, attach it to IAM role, and then attach that to your App Runner service. Okay, and then health checks as well, and auto scaling. So auto scaling is built into App Runner, and the way auto scaling works is App Runner scales off of requests. So you can see here, the default configuration out of the box is when you have 100 concurrent requests, App Runner will begin to auto scale to ensure that you're at that level or below. And the minimum maximum count of App Runner instances is between 1 and 25. So you can configure this on your own, but we're going to stick with the default configuration for now. Okay, I'm going to hit next. We have everything ready to go. So remember, all I have is a code base in GitHub. I have a simple definition that says npm install node index.js to run my application, and that's it. I didn't have to build a Docker image. I said Docker more than I actually am physically doing anything with Docker here, okay? Because I don't have to do anything with it if we choose this path. So now we're going to click Create and Deploy. So while this deploys, a couple things I want to point out, and then I'm going to go check out the chat just to see if there are any questions in there that I can bring up. So you see all of your logs here. You have your deployment logs. So I can see what's happening with my deployments in real time with the deployment logs, my application logs as well. So App Runner will actually build a CloudWatch log group for all of these different functions. And again, when you're building and running these environments, if you didn't use App Runner, you have to think about, how am I logging? Where am I logging to? Am I managing a log service, a log server? How's all that working? App Runner will just by default, it's logging to CloudWatch. So you have that visibility into your application out of the box. We also have activity and then metrics. So these are metrics that you can see: request count, responses, latency, and as well as how many instances are running. So in App Runner, you have a service, okay? And then a service is comprised of one or many instances. Think of an instance as just an instantiation of that container that's running your code. That's it. So, and then your configuration as well as custom domains. So you can actually link App Runner to an existing domain in Route 53. So if you want to have a, some sort of vanity URL, and so on, you can use custom domains. So now I'm going to take a moment, because this will take a couple of minutes to, it's going to build the, basically behind the scenes, it's building the pipeline. It's, building all of the infrastructure to run our service. So there was a question that came in around the difference between App Runner and Fargate. So this is a really good question, and I apologize for not mentioning this earlier, actually. So remember earlier I talked about running an orchestrator. You need if you're going to run containers, generally the approach is you have an orchestrator, and the orchestrator consists of that control plane, which orchestrates where your containers run, and then your data plane. Generally, your data plane is where you say, here's where containers can run. They're generally virtual machines, right? And these virtual machines will run those containers and so on. But when you run the underlying instances in your data plane, you have to think about scaling, patching, and rolling out new, instances and all of that, and securing those instances. It's a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of work that goes into that. AWS Fargate is a service that abstracts all of that away from you as someone who's using an orchestrator deploying your containers. So with AWS Fargate, I still need to be orchestrator aware. So I need to be running either ECS, Amazon ECS, or Amazon EKS. And when I choose where I'm running my containers within those clusters, I have the choice of running on my own EC2 infrastructure, my own virtual machines to schedule the containers, or I can choose AWS Fargate, which AWS will manage the underlying EC2 instance and launch the container on that instance. It'll launch your task or your pod on that instance. So Fargate is just the managed compute for the data plane. App Runner, but I still have to, be running and cognizant of the orchestrator. With App Runner, behind the scenes, App Runner is actually using AWS Fargate and Amazon ECS with AWS Fargate. But that's all abstracted from me. So when you're using App Runner, while we are taking advantage of serverless compute with Fargate, you as the user don't have to think about, launching a cluster and then creating a task definition in ECS, launching a service, and so on. App Runner just handles all of that for you. All you do is say, here's your code. So look at App Runner as just another layer of abstraction. So you have kind of the lowest layer of abstraction, which is I'm running a cluster. In that cluster, whether that's Amazon ECS or Amazon EKS or Kubernetes, I'm running the EC2 instances, which is where my containers get scheduled. That's the lowest level. Then you have a level up, which is, but remember, I'm still responsible for managing those EC2 instances, patching. These are all things I have to think about, okay? And scaling as well. And then there's a layer up, which is AWS Fargate, where now I don't have to manage those underlying EC2 instances. And AWS Fargate, another thing to mention, is it's a one-to-one relationship. So one task, okay, so basically a task is a container or a set of like containers or a pod, gets its own virtual machine. So you're not sharing this virtual machine. You don't have multiple containers sharing the same virtual machine in your cluster. It's a one-to-one mapping. So that's the next layer of abstraction. So we have EC2 as our data plane. Then we have Fargate. But I'm still, at this point, I'm still cluster aware and I'm still orchestrator aware. And then there's that top level of abstraction, which is App Runner, where all of these components underneath are irrelevant to me. All I'm doing is saying, App Runner, here's my container image, or here's my code, run it, figure out how to scale it in and out, and that's a big one, by the way, not just scale out, but scale back in and build the CI/CD pipelines, do all that for me. So hopefully that clarifies things a bit. If there's more questions on that, please let me know. I am glad to dive into that, deeper. But those are kind of the levels of management and abstraction, with App Runner being at the top there. Okay, so we've created our service. It's done. I've been doing a lot of talking, so thank you for listening to me. So this is the App Runner demo Node.js app I just deployed. It gives me a domain. I have a URL. And if I go to that URL, you can see hello world. We did it. We deployed a complex hello world app. That's it. So when I talk about the power with AWS App Runner, I mentioned all these other things that you have to think about and manage if you're not using App Runner. But boy, does App Runner make life easy. And it's just getting better and better, and we're continuously improving the service. So all I did was say, here's my code. Here's how you run my code, deploy, and App Runner did the rest. Now, let's say I want to go back here, and now I want to add a new endpoint. Okay. So I go to my app. Let's copy this, and let's add a new endpoint that says App Runner Workshop. So / App Runner Workshop. I'm just gonna add some text here. Thank you everyone for joining. You are all the best. Okay, and I mean that. You're all the best. So / App Runner Workshop. So again, in a real world, someone's submitting a pull request with peer review. We get a +1, multiple +1s, we merge the code. But since I'm doing it live, I'm going to just merge it straight into main like a renegade. And I'm going to click commit changes. Okay, so I've updated this. What do you think's happening in App Runner? Spoiler alert, App Runner is triggering a deployment on my behalf. See this right here? Operation in progress. I merged that code not even 5 seconds ago, and App Runner has already caught the change and is beginning a deployment. So what's going to happen now is App Runner is going to, it's behind the scenes, it's going to build a new container image based off of my code. And remember, when I say build a new container image, I'm not doing it because I just said, hey, here's my code. Here's how you run my code. Here's how you install the dependencies. App Runner is building a container image, creating all of the necessary revisions for your latest deployment. It's going to bring it up in parallel, health check the service, make sure everything's good, and then flip the switch and we'll have our new running service. So like if I were to go right now, I already forgot what I named it. Boy, App Runner Workshop, really easy. So the endpoint is App Runner Workshop. I misspell it too. That's awesome. I misspelled it. So it'll be another change I'll have to fix. But look, it's not here yet, right? My web service says that endpoint doesn't exist because it's actually deploying as we speak. So with App Runner, you have insight into your deployments. I can see in the event log when a deployment was triggered, what's happening with the just any events around my service. I can see the deployment logs. So you can see, here's what's happening. So if you're familiar with Docker, when you run, this looks very familiar because we're actually building a container image for you. We're building the image, we're pushing it up to a container registry in ECR and beginning that deployment process. So that's pretty much it. So within a matter of, a couple of minutes, we'll have our new endpoint deployed and we are ready to go. That's it. Okay, so I'm going to take a brief pause, look at the questions, and then we're going to move on to the next step because I talk so much that I sometimes lose track of time and I want to make sure I do all the cool things. But the next step is we're going to build a Docker image. We're going to push that image to ECR, Elastic Container Registry, Amazon Elastic Container Registry. And we're going to take that image and we're going to use that as our service for our service code. Okay. So let me just take a quick moment here to, oh my goodness, so many people chatting. I love it. Okay. Yeah, so really good questions. A good question came in. Okay, let's see here. So a good question came in around, if I'm running like a web scraping service, or I just want to run a service that runs on a schedule. Should I use App Runner or should I look somewhere else? So this is entirely up to you, and ultimately, kind of what level of management do you want? So you can absolutely use App Runner to do this. You can have but remember, this is a publicly exposed, has an endpoint to it. So, but if you wanted to just run it like in a loop, you could do that. But, you have like an endpoint, it's maybe not exactly solving the problem here, because this is long running. However, if you were to, like, my recommendation would probably be to use something like, AWS Fargate, run it as like a scheduled task, maybe. You could use something like AWS Step Functions. You could use Amazon ECS, but it just depends on what you're looking to build and how much you want to actually create on your own. So App Runner is definitely an easy button, and you could do that. But probably the best tool for the job here would be to use something like AWS Fargate with Amazon ECS, use something like Step Functions, or just CloudWatch events. You could use like an event bus to trigger, this to run on a schedule. That way, you're only paying for that service when it launches, does what it needs to do, and then it goes away. So you're only paying for the time you're using it. That's the more ideal approach. Okay. So good questions. Okay. How would I use CI/CD solutions with App Runner for things like deploying to multiple environments? That's an awesome question. So the way I would handle it here, there's a few ways. So one, like, again, with App Runner, you have, App Runner has a service to branch. When you're talking about code, it's like a service to branch. So if you were using Git as your kind of source of truth there, really then you'd have to think like, am I using like a branch per environment? And then each, environment could, be automatically deployed through App Runner that way. I'm not a huge fan of having multiple branches, but that's a way you could do it. The other way you could do this is you could create like a pipeline in AWS Code Pipeline. So you could use Code Pipeline. You could build a container image, and you could push that image to, multiple environments. So you could have an App Runner dev service, App Runner, test, App Runner production. And each of those could point to different container images. And in your pipeline, you first deploy the dev image. Let's say that always deploys, right? And then, after a series of tests, it progresses to the test environment. And then maybe you put a gate there, unless your tests are, you have really good testing, really good roll forward, roll back strategies implemented. You could, ignore and just have it, kind of progress all the way through. But that's how I would do it. I would use like I would have a like Code Pipeline, or, a Jenkins pipeline, or whatever tool you use. And I would just define each environment in a stage. And in each stage is where I would push that container image. And then, I would use actually one container image, and I would progress that image through the environments. So I wouldn't enable automatic deployments if I was doing multiple environments. I would just do it for like, production and stage environments. So let's see. And so there's a question around, any workshops for Fargate. Yes, I have. I do host quite a few workshops for AWS Fargate with Amazon ECS. Check out ecsworkshop.com as well. And there's a deploying microservices chapter where we walk through how to deploy this, how to deploy AWS Fargate using Amazon ECS, and we walk through all of that. Definitely check that out. I do host workshops quite a bit on ECS Workshop. So just follow me on Twitter to see when I'm hosting these workshops. So you can sign up when they come about. Really great questions, folks. I'm loving these questions. Okay, I'm going to go back now, and I'm going to begin the deployment using a Docker file. Okay, so now we're going to use Docker to build and run through this. And one other thing on the CI/CD pipeline, every environment's different, so it really just depends on what your environment or environments look like. But I would definitely recommend, I would wrap a pipeline around App Runner, and you can use CloudFormation to point to certain images, for your App Runner services. But I would definitely, when you have multiple environments, I would use something like Code Pipeline, and I would trigger deployments from the with CloudFormation or with the SDK for each environment, rather than having automated environments. But if you have a single environment model with App Runner, you just want to keep testing. For dev environments, I would keep automated deployments on there, and then just for your higher level environments, either use a separate branch or have a pipeline that defines when those get deployed to. Okay, so in this workshop, in this section of the workshop, we're going to need Docker. Okay, so if you're using the Cloud9 instance, Docker is installed. If you're not, you have to install Docker. Okay, just for this workshop. It's not to say that to use to build and manage containers, you have to use Docker. But for the workshop, we do use Docker. Okay. So we're going to create these two files. Okay. So we're going to create a new directory, App Runner example, dir App Runner example. We're going to cd in that directory, and we're going to start with creating our index.js. So we're going to vim index.js, and then we're going to do this. I'm going to add another endpoint here, and this endpoint is going to say /Docker. Don't you love it when it doesn't paste nice? And tabs, I'm a big fan of tabs. Just kidding. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do here is this endpoint was deployed with Docker. Yay. Perfect. Okay. One other thing, I forgot to go back to our application that deployed earlier, but you can see I went to the App Runner Workshop endpoint, misspelled App Runner Workshop endpoint, and you can see, thank you everyone for joining. You're all the best. So I deployed an endpoint all I did was update my code, merge that code, App Runner took care of the rest. Okay, so now we're going to go back. We're going to create the package JSON. Package.json, and such great questions. Again, set paste. Let's do that. Okay, so there's my package.json, same thing as I did earlier. And we're going to create a Docker file this time. So the main difference here is, instead of relying on App Runner to build my Docker file, Docker image behind the scenes, I'm now doing it. And now this gives me a little more flexibility with App Runner. If I'm using a language that's not supported by App Runner, and when I say not supported, I mean not supported using the simple, setting up your environment, using the, let's go here. Oops, just so I can show you. Let's go here. Okay. Shoot. Express. So, rather than going through the configuration steps here, these are where you only have the languages supported, Python and Node.js. Right now, we are working on supporting more languages in the future. So if there's a language you want to see supported, go to the App Runner roadmap, which I will be posting here soon, or maybe someone can post in the chat as well. But if there's a language you really want, submit an issue on that roadmap, say, here's the language I want, here's why, because I'm awesome, whatever it is, and go through that. Okay. So going back, a Docker file is basically a set of instructions for how we want to build and run our code. So the nice thing about Docker is it all starts with a base image here. So what I'm saying is, from this upstream image, this Node.js image, I want you to build. I want you to build off of this, starting here. So this includes the operating system, as well as all the packages I need to run and install my Node.js application. So it's really nice with Docker is you can pull these upstream images that have all of the dependencies built in already, so you can just get going and get your stuff deployed, rather than having to, like, you could go to a lower level image, like something like like CentOS or Ubuntu, but then I have to think about not just installing my packages here, but I have to do like an apt-get install this, or yum install that. So there's just more to it. Okay, so we have our upstream image, which is the Node.js 14 image. This tag is saying we want Node 14. We're saying this is the directory we want to work in. Okay, so when we launch and we install, we want to run in this directory, user source app. We're going to copy our package JSON into that directory. Then when we're building this container image, we're going to run an npm install. Then we're going to copy our application source code. We want to run this container on port 3000. And here is the command to run my application. That's it. Now, obviously, Docker files, there's ways you can optimize, do multi-stage builds. There's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with Docker. For now, this is plenty, and this is gonna do the job. So that's it. That's our Docker file. We've defined how we want to run this. So if you run an ls in this directory now, you should have a Docker file, an index.js, and a package JSON. Okay. So let's move on to the next step in the workshop, because we're going to create a repository in Amazon ECR. Okay, so we're going to go to the Amazon ECR console. And as you can see, I already have a bunch of stuff here, but I don't think I don't have it here. So we're going to create a private repository, and we are going to name it Simple Express Repository. Okay. And we're going to leave all the default settings, and we're going to click create. One cool thing about Amazon ECR is it does have image scanning. It's a free service that comes with Amazon ECR that you can actually scan for vulnerabilities on your images in Amazon ECR. So really cool. Okay, so we're going to create the repository. Now you'll see here, you'll have a green pop-up that says view push commands. We're going to copy each line, which is going to do the following things. One, it's going to log into the Docker registry, which is Amazon ECR. And to do that, we get a password via the AWS SDK, via the AWS CLI. We're going to get a password to log into ECR, and then we're going to pipe that into a Docker login command. So now we're logged into our registry. We're going to build our image. We're going to tag our image so it matches the name of our upstream repository, and then we're going to push it. Okay, so I'm going to go through those steps now. That. And then we're going to build. Let's do this. Let's move this over. And then, if there's questions, please keep them coming in. And we're going to tag and then push. So what's happening right now is you can see we're pulling the upstream image. And from here, we are then, it's going to copy the code. It's going to install the packages, our dependencies, running that npm install. And then it's going to copy our source code into the working directory, and we're ready to go. So let's tag the image. And lastly, let's push that image up to our registry. Okay. So here's the thing. This is cool. I push this up. I mean, that's really great. But realistically, I'm probably going to want to test this locally. And I'm going to be honest. I think using Docker is a really good scenario, a really good use case for having your environment locally be a mirror image of what you're running in your actual environments. And that's because with Docker, when you create a container image, that image is your artifact. That artifact should remain the same from when you push that, you're testing it locally to your code changes to when that gets pushed into ECR. So your testing experience locally versus, as if you were to run it, locally like this, which is fine. But what if I'm running a different version of Node.js, compared to what is actually running in our real world environments? Docker gives me that same experience locally or whether it's in production, because that artifact is the same, which that artifact is this container image. So if I were to run Docker run, let's do this, and then, -p. So now if I were to run this Docker image locally, you can see it is, it's running. I'm able to test it, and I don't have to worry about like using like NVM or different types of, worrying about if I have a package globally versus locally. I don't have to think about any of that. All I do is curl localhost 3000, and there's my container running, right? And then what was the Docker? This was deployed with Docker, yay. So I'm able to test these changes, and I know that when I'm testing this container image running locally, assuming obviously that after I push this, my code gets changed and goes through a proper build process, my artifact that I've tested with here is the same. That's what's running in App Runner. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we need to go back to the App Runner console. Okay. So we're going to go back here. And now that we have our repository created, let's go to App Runner, and we're going to connect it to ECR. So one thing in the workshop here is there's a step where you have to create an IAM policy and attach it. We shouldn't have to do that. So what we're going to do is go back here, and we're going to name it. We're going to choose container registry. Okay. And what we want to do is just find our image here, which is, oh, did I create it in the wrong? I may have created it in the wrong region here. Let's see. Did I create it? Let's see. Simple Express repository. So I find my repository here, hit paste, and then I'm going to let it create a new service role. So we're going to do automatic deployment triggers. Okay. So what I've done here is, instead of last time where I said, here's my source code, here's how you package and build my application, now what I'm saying is, forget all of that. Look at my container registry for any time there's a change, and deploy the latest image that has been pushed. And in order to connect, we need to give App Runner access. So I can actually say, I can tell App Runner, just create an access, a role for me to connect this image to, or this service to this image. And actually, so let me just go back here really quick. Yeah, so one thing is you want to make sure you're in the right region. I actually deployed this to the incorrect region. So let me fix that really quick. So you want to make sure this is in the same region you're working in. Simple Express app. Let's do that. And then let's just really quickly copy these commands here. Oops. Okay, let's go here. Let's see our example. Log into the right region. So just make sure that when you create this, again, you're in the right region. I think it's because that deep link we have in the workshop actually takes you to, like, by default, US East 1. So if you're not in US East 1, you may have a problem. I already tagged it, so we're good. And then let's push it. That's something we need to fix in the workshop there. Okay, so I'm going to push this new image and we should be good to go. While I wait, let's see here. So there was a question that came in, which is good, just to clarify a little bit. The event log shows deployment or infrastructure level logs. What if we want to dump application level logs as well? Is that possible? Yes, absolutely. So again, the neat thing with App Runner is it takes care of all of that for you. And so the event log, you have two types of logs here. So the event log here in the console is just going to show you event logs. Okay, and you can get this, like, we have that that integration built in. Now, if you want to see your application logs, you just go down here, you click application logs, and now it's going to pop up and show you your application logs. So absolutely, application logs are accessible here in the App Runner console. I can drill down last minute, I can see what's going on, and so on. So yes, great question, and just needed to clarify that. So thank you for that. So you can see I just hit it a bunch, and now we have a bunch of logs. So you can see these in near real time. Okay, so let's go back here, and now hopefully I can find my image. So it should be, let's see, Amazon ECR. If I go back, let's do a little refresh there. Oh, there's my Simple Express app. Yep. If I go to my app, you can see it's pushed. Okay, so now we're going to put my image URL here, US West 2. Perfect. Create new service role, automatic deployments. I'm going to name this App Runner Workshop Docker. My port, I want my port to be 3000. And that's it. I'm going to leave everything else the same. We're going to click next, and we're going to create and deploy. And so now what's happening is App Runner, again, behind the scenes, it's going to look at this container image, and when deployments are triggered, it will then trigger the deployment, build all the underlying infra that's needed, and then build the deployment process and all of that for me. So this will take a couple of minutes. And that's about it. So this will take a few minutes to go through. But basically, that's the gist of it. So as you can see with App Runner, it's a very simple way to get your code up and running with a public endpoint in a matter of minutes, with zero management from you as the user. All you're worried about is, where does my code live? Am I deploying from my code, or am I deploying from a container image? And App Runner will handle the rest. Blue-green deployments, auto scaling, and all of that good stuff. So we are running low on time here. So one thing I want to mention is there is a survey at the end. So I always appreciate it. Surveys are so important. So please give your feedback. I hope you had as much fun as I did here. But we will be hosting more workshops in the future. So that's another thing too, is give feedback if you want to see another type of workshop. If there's something you want to, to get a deep dive in, I am glad to do that. I'd love to host, a workshop that folks want to see more content with. But yeah, so while this builds, this takes, a few minutes here. Why don't we do something really quick here? Okay, this is where I like to go a little bit off the script, and let's do this. Okay. Let's send some load to this application, because I mentioned there was auto scaling, right? Okay, hey, and then let's just move hey to hey. Okay, so let's send some load to one of our applications here. Okay. And while our Docker one is running, we're going to do this. We're going to copy the domain. Perfect. You can see that. And we're going to do this. So we're going to do concurrent request, number of requests. We're going to say a lot. And then we're going to say concurrently, I want to run 200, let's say 600 requests. And then of course I need a URL. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm load testing the application right now. Okay. So that I'm throwing a bunch of load concurrent, about 600 concurrent connections per second to this endpoint here, which is, I believe I chose this one, the App Runner Node.js. So, if we were to look at application logs, I'm not sure. Let's see. Go last minute, apply. You can see a ton of requests coming in concurrently. If I were to go to metrics here, let's take a look at our metrics, because now what we should see is it's going to start to spike. Okay. And you can see our active instances, we're at 1. So App Runner will scale down to 1. That's the lowest number. And then let's actually hit the endpoint 2 while we're waiting for this. Let's go to this domain. And you can see it works, right? It's working okay. Doing a good job handling the concurrency. App Runner Workshop. Everything's working. But because we set our auto scaling, or because auto scaling by default is set to 100 concurrent requests, and we want to scale at that 100 mark, we want to make sure that for each instance, okay, so each instantiation of our App Runner service, like with each container running under that service, we want to make sure that we're meeting that 100 concurrent requests per task, per container. So what we're going to see shortly is the app will scale back up. So perfect. Okay, so this will take a couple minutes. What I'm going to do while this goes through is we have a few more minutes before I wrap things up. And there's my Docker one. Check this out. So remember, I deployed from that container image. So this is my container image deployment. This was deployed with Docker, yay. So while we're waiting for the auto scaling to kick in, let's just again do a quick recap of everything we did, all the cool stuff that we did, and really all the cool stuff that App Runner did while we just simply deployed code. So 1, we had a code base. We had we basically said we know how we install our dependencies, and we know what version we need to run. And here's how we run our code. Here's our actual code. That's all we had to give App Runner. And we said when changes are made to Git, to this branch, when a commit is made, I want you to trigger deployment automatically. That was all we had to do. And App Runner built the service, manages auto scaling, manages deployments through blue-green, and that's it. It is all handled within App Runner. So all I'm focused on is here writing my code. That's it. The next thing was we built a Docker image with that same code base. We created a Docker file. We were able to test that Docker file locally and see here is what my code looks like locally running as a Docker image. We created an App Runner service, pointed it to that Docker image in Amazon ECR, and App Runner built all the underlying infrastructure, built all the deployment mechanisms. All I had to do was create a Docker image and push it to that repo. And App Runner created it, hosted it publicly, created that URL for me, and I didn't have to do anything outside of that. So all of the components that normally you would have to think about are fully managed with App Runner. And then auto scaling. So we decided to throw a whole bunch of load at our service, and I wanted to see it auto scale. Check this out. We now have 7 instances running of this service. So I triggered auto scaling. You can see our auto scaling directly correlates with our requests, our request count. So as our requests started to come up, so did our concurrent requests, so did our active instances of App Runner. So just for fun, I threw load at our application and it auto-scaled for me. So I didn't have to create any auto-scaling policies. I didn't have to do any of that. And again, my app still works. Or maybe it doesn't. I don't know if this is the right one. There we go. So there you have it. So there is a survey at the end. I do ask that, please, feedback's so important. I hope, you all had a really good time with me today. This was a shorter workshop. I do host longer workshops, sometimes, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour workshops. So if you're interested in those, reach out to me. Let me know what you want to hear about, what you want to see me demo live and break and have fun with. Also, we do have containersfromthecouch.com. We have a ton of content there. We've created a bunch of live shows that are recorded there, where we've talked about a whole bunch of different services on AWS related to containers. So definitely check that out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it off, and then we'll come back and wrap it up with, I'll go through a couple more questions that came in the chat, and that'll be it.